They told Clint Eastwood to stay quiet, but he chose the truth. And once he opened his mouth, everything inside that studio froze, like something heavy had just broken loose. If you believe that truth still matters, then subscribe now. Because this story will take you to the line between silence and courage. Clint had arrived at the Good Morning America studio earlier than expected. He stood alone in the hallway, his hands tucked inside the pockets of a long dark coat, staring at the floor tiles as if something inside him refused to settle. A producer walked by, offered a forced smile, and mumbled something about coffee. Clint did not respond. His mind was not in the room. It was back in a place he thought he had buried years ago. The topic that morning was supposed to be light, a discussion about legacy, cinema, and how American film had changed. But just 15 minutes before airtime, someone from the network had slid a paper across the desk to George Stephanopoulos. A set of questions had been added, none of which Clint had agreed to. When George glanced up and met Clint's eyes, there was a silent message there, one that Clint read loud and clear. He was being set up. As the cameras rolled, the lights felt too hot. George smiled for the viewers and leaned in, offering Clint a handshake. Clint took it, held it for half a second longer than normal, and then leaned back, arms crossed. The conversation started safe. They talked about the early days, about his love for storytelling, about what it meant to be a man in a time where masculinity was being redefined every day. Clint answered carefully, choosing his words like someone crossing a minefield. Then came the question. "So Clint," George said, tilting his head, "you once said that the media manipulates more than it informs. Do you still believe that?" Clint did not blink. He did not shift. Instead, he slowly leaned forward, placed both elbows on the table and said, "I do not believe it. I know it." There was a pause. A real pause, not a cut-to-commercial pause, but one of those silences that stretches and stings. George cleared his throat. "Would you say that about this network?" Clint smiled. "If the shoe fits." Off camera, producers began waving their hands. A red light blinked. But Clint did not stop. He said something next that would never make it to the edited reruns. Something that made two crew members gasp and the floor manager drop her clipboard. He said, "You all do not invite me here to speak. You invite me here so you can bury me quietly. I have lived too long to play along with that." The studio was dead quiet for a few seconds, but inside the control room, everything was falling apart. Clint's words had not been angry. They were calm, heavy, and full of something George had not expected. Truth without apology. Behind the glass, an assistant producer whispered, "Do we cut?" But no one answered. The director just stared at the monitor, lips pressed tight. George tried to recover. He straightened in his seat, smiled faintly, and said, "Clint, I respect your honesty, but surely you understand the responsibility that comes with being in front of millions of viewers." Clint leaned back, but his eyes never left George's face. "I understand responsibility better than most men alive. I fought a war at 19. I buried friends with no names on their graves. I made films that spoke about justice when the world only cared about box office numbers. And I have watched this country pretend that silence is peace. What I said was not reckless. It was real." George adjusted his earpiece, clearly hearing instructions, but his fingers trembled just slightly. "So what are you saying, Clint? That networks like ours—" "I am saying," Clint interrupted, "that you do not want a guest. You want a mirror, but only if it flatters you." For a moment, George froze. Then he forced a chuckle. "Well, I suppose you have earned the right to say what you want." "I have not earned it," Clint replied. "I paid for it." "There is a difference." It was the way he said it, not loud, not angry, just firm. That voice had once commanded entire rooms in silence, and now, live on television, it had just cut through layers of smiles and polished scripts. Suddenly, a voice came through the speakers. A senior producer's voice, trying to save the broadcast. "We are heading to break in 10:9. But Clint stood up, not rushed, not shaken. Just steady, like he had already decided something the night before and had waited for the moment to come. He removed the mic from his collar, placed it on the table gently, and said, "I came here thinking I might talk about cinema, maybe even legacy. But what I realize sitting here is that none of that matters if a man does not recognize when he is being used." George started to speak, but Clint raised a hand. "Do not. Not everything needs a rebuttal. Sometimes it just needs to be heard." And with that, he turned around and began walking off the set, leaving everyone, crew, host, audience, suspended in a kind of silence that rarely happens on live television. It was not dramatic. It was not rehearsed. It was something else entirely. A man had just walked away from noise and somehow made more noise than all the shouting in the world ever could. As Clint stepped into the hallway, the echo of his boots seemed louder than usual. The building was still buzzing, but behind those walls, something had changed. People whispered, but no one stopped him. He walked past studio interns, cameramen, and makeup artists, all suddenly unsure whether to nod, speak, or just pretend not to see him. Clint did not look back. He reached the side exit near the parking lot. Outside, the wind was dry, the sky gray. For a moment, he stood still. He was not angry. He was not embarrassed. But there was something in his eyes, the kind of sadness that does not scream but rests, like an old wound that never healed. Behind him, the studio doors pushed open. A man followed, not George, not a producer, but one of the young crew. Members who had been silently adjusting lights just minutes earlier. He looked about 30, nervous, eyes shifting. "Mr. Eastwood," he said softly. Clint did not turn around. "Do not apologize," he said. "You have done nothing wrong." The young man hesitated. I just wanted to say, my father watched all your films. He used to say you were the last real man on screen. I think he was right." Clint finally turned to face him. He studied the kid's face, saw the sincerity in his expression, and nodded once. "Tell your father ... thank you." Then he walked away. Back inside the studio, chaos had not yet calmed. Producers argued over commercial timing. Executives were on the phone. George Stephanopoulos sat still in his chair, staring at the empty seat across from him. He looked lost, not in defeat, but in reflection. Something had landed, something honest, and it was not going away anytime soon. One of the assistant producers leaned in. He walked out live. "We need to release a statement. Control the narrative before someone else does," George said. Nothing. His fingers tapped the edge of the table. Slowly he whispered, "Did you hear what he said? About silence being peace?" The assistant blinked. "Yes, why?" George leaned back in his seat. "Because I think we are all a little too comfortable with silence." Meanwhile, Clint sat inside his car, hands resting on the wheel but the engine off. He stared through the windshield, lost in thought. A phone buzzed beside him, not a smartphone, but an old flip model, scratched and worn. He ignored it. He was not thinking about the show, the fallout, or the headlines that would surely follow. He was thinking about something deeper, the way everything now felt like theater, and how even truth needed a camera angle to survive. Then something shifted in his expression. Not regret, not pride, something harder to name. He started the engine and drove off, not toward home, but somewhere far quieter, where voices did not need microphones and men did not need to explain themselves just to be understood. He did not go home. He drove north, far from the city, past the traffic and the noise, into the hills where the roads narrowed and trees swallowed the sky. There was a cabin up there, quiet, hidden, untouched by modern noise. It was not marked on maps, and only a handful of people even knew it existed. Clint had not been there in over 3 years. When he arrived, the air felt colder. He stepped out of the car, stretched his back, and looked around as if waiting for something familiar to greet him. Nothing did. The place was the same, but he was not. Inside, dust covered everything. He did not wipe it off. He dropped his coat on the chair, sat down near the fireplace, and picked up a box from the floor. It was heavy, wooden, and locked. The key still hung on a nail near the window. He opened it. Inside were letters. Old, folded, some yellow with age. Most of them were written by his brother, Mark, the one who had died 10 years ago. No one in Hollywood ever asked about Mark. They asked about films, fame, politics, but not the man Clint used to fight with, laugh with, and bury memories for. He pulled out the last letter. The date on it was 1 week before Mark passed. Clint had never opened it. Something inside him had refused. But today felt different. Today, everything had cracked wide open. He unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was rushed, uneven. Mark had always written like he was racing time. Clint, you are going to hate me for saying this, but I have to. You are not the man they think you are, and that is a good thing. You were never built for applause. You were built for silence. For standing when no one else will. The world will try to make you soft or silent or angry. Do not give it what it wants. Speak when it costs you something. Only then does it matter. Mark, Clint read it again. Then once more. And after a long breath, he folded it back and placed it in his lap. His hands were shaking now, not from weakness but from memory. That letter was not advice. It was a warning. One he had ignored for far too long. Back in the city, his walkout was already everywhere. Clips of him rising, speaking, leaving, all over news cycles. Some called it heroic, others called it dramatic. But no one knew what he was really thinking. They did not know about Mark. They did not know about the silence that followed fame. Clint stood up, walked outside, and stared at the sky. The stars were faint, but they were there. He had no interest in explaining himself anymore. He was not a story. He was a man, and that, somehow, had become the rarest thing on television. The next morning, Clint stood barefoot on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the mist roll over the hills. He looked older than yesterday, but also lighter, not in body, but in something behind his eyes. He had not slept much. He had stayed up reading old letters, each one pulling him further from the noise he had walked away from and closer to the man he used to be. His phone buzzed again, for the 5th time in an hour. This time, he answered. It was Janet, his long-time agent, the only person in the industry who still spoke to him like a human being. "Clint," she said, "you have to come back. You know what they are saying? I can guess. They are calling it a breakdown." There was a pause. Clint looked out at the trees and smiled faintly. "Let them. You cannot just disappear after something like that. The studio's furious. The network is trying to edit the footage like it was all a misunderstanding. They are cutting the part where you said, 'I know what I said,'" Clint replied. "And I said it knowing they would do exactly that." Janet sighed. "They are building a version of you now. One that is easier to digest, polished, confused. Sad old man loses temper on air, that kind of thing. I would rather be misunderstood than controlled," he said. "You know that. But your legacy, Clint, my legacy is not theirs. To manage." There was silence on the line. Then Janet spoke again, her voice softer this time. "What are you going to do now?" Clint took a sip of his coffee. "I am going to remind people what it means to be a man in a time like this." She exhaled slowly. "Well, ... If anyone can, it is you." He hung up, not out of disrespect, but because the conversation had reached its end. Words had limits. Action did not. Later that day, Clint took a notebook and sat near the window, where the light came in through broken slats of wood. He began writing, Not a script, not a speech, but something else. Something personal. He wrote about silence, about regret, about his brother, and about a world that no longer respected the weight of truth. He did not write for anyone else. He wrote because if he did not, the truth would stay locked inside his chest like a ticking thing. He wrote because his words were not meant for ratings. They were meant for the few who still listened when someone spoke without performance. And while the world rushed to spin headlines, Clint Eastwood was finally doing what he had not done in years, listening to the version of himself that had no camera in front of him, no lights, no lines. Just a man, a voice, and a quiet too sacred to sell. 3 days later, Clint returned to the city. Not for a press conference, not for damage control. He came unannounced, walking through the lobby of a quiet office building tucked between two glass towers that reflected everything but told nothing. He did not carry a statement. He carried a notebook. Upstairs, he walked into a private studio, not the kind with flashing lights or velvet chairs, but the kind used for independent recordings. A friend of his owned the place, a veteran, a man who owed nothing to anyone. Clint handed him the notebook and said, "I want to record every page, one take, no edits." The man looked surprised. "Is this your response?" "No," Clint said. "It is my truth." He sat down in front of the mic, put on the headphones, and opened to the first page. His voice did not tremble. It was deep, raw, and slow, not for drama, but for weight. He spoke not like a man trying to explain himself, but like someone remembering what it felt like to be whole. He spoke of Mark, of the letters, of how silence had followed him for years, even when people claimed he was loud. He spoke of being young, being praised, being used, and being forgotten. He spoke about standing on stages built by other men's sweat and refusing to bow when the script no longer fit. He spoke about that morning on Good Morning America, not to defend what he said, but to remind people why he said it. And then, in the last 5 minutes of the recording, he said something no one expected. He revealed that George Stephanopoulos was not the reason he walked out. The questions were not the cause. The setup was not new. He had seen it coming. What had pushed him to walk off was simpler, sadder, and more human, he said. "I looked into that room and saw a reflection of every place I stayed too long, every time I stayed quiet, every time I gave a soft answer when I should have spoken harder, and I realized I was not angry with them. I was angry with myself." When he finished recording, the room stayed still. The engineer did not speak. No one moved. Clint stood up, handed the notebook to the man, and said, "Release it when you are ready. Or do not. Either way, I have said what needed to be said." Then, he walked out. A week later, the recording went online. No title, no promotion. Just a plain video called Clint Eastwood for those still listening. Within hours, it began to spread. People did not click because it was viral. They clicked because they were tired. Tired of noise. Tired of fake apologies. Tired of men with voices pretending to have none. And as they listened, one truth settled into their bones, that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is speak when the world begs him to stay silent.